Sometimes the loudest voice in the room isn't the one that speaks, but the one that refuses to bow. In a quiet town where people barely looked twice at the old man in the worn blazer, no one expected the weight he carried. Not on his shoulders, but over his heart. It wasn't until a judge tried to strip him of the one symbol that couldn't be ordered away that the room and the nation remembered what honor really means. What unfolded in that courtroom wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. And from the silence of a humble veteran came a message so powerful, so deeply human, it echoed across the country. Because dignity doesn't demand the spotlight, it simply endures. Remove that medal before you speak to this court. The judge's voice cut through the silence like a cold blade, sharp, precise, and final. It wasn't a request, it was an order, wrapped in authority. The room tensed. At the stand, the old man didn't flinch. He stood still, his posture weary, but not broken. His hands, gnarled by time and something harder than labor, trembled slightly. Draped over his frame was a well-worn blazer, its original navy hue now weathered to a softer, almost denim blue. Above his heart, the Medal of Honor gleamed, not in defiance, not in vanity, but because it was real, and it had always gleamed like that. The courtroom shifted. Some in the audience looked away, uncomfortable. A few smirked as if they had just witnessed an old man make a social misstep. But the veterans present, the ones who knew what it meant to wear that medal, sat silent, still, reverent. The man didn't meet the judge's tone with resistance. He met it with something older, deeper. Not defiance, not pride, just the full weight of a life that had already seen too much. Then from the back of the room, a figure rose. The soft creak of the wooden bench beneath him gave way to the crisp authority of dress blues. A soldier in full uniform, rows of ribbons stretched across his chest, stood with quiet dignity. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but it stopped everything in the room. "Your Honor, may I speak?" What happened next would not only shift the direction of a single hearing, it would ripple outward, erasing the tidy outlines of a judge's reputation and reminding a nation of what real honor looks like. And more importantly, who still carries it. Walt Harland didn't own a suit. What he wore that morning was the same outfit he wore to church, to funerals, to every Veterans Day ceremony since he came back home. That blazer, faded, familiar, and softened by time, clung to his frame not as a symbol of formality, but of habit, of respect. His boots were clean but worn, their leather cracked and softened at the edges. They were polished not to impress, but as a small act of reverence for the steps he was about to take. The medal over his chest didn't shine for show. It just did, because that's what real things do. He moved slowly, not because he was weak, but because caution had been trained into his bones. Walt had once inspected every bolt on a helicopter before letting it fly. He'd been the kind of man who recounted every tool before mending a leaking fuel line. That same meticulous attention carried him now, step by deliberate step, across the uneven sidewalk, past the weather-stained courthouse lawn, and up the marble stairs that had seen far less weight than the one he carried. Willow Bend wasn't a town that needed an excuse to talk. But when word spread that Walt Harland would be testifying, openly in public, the usual chatter quieted to something softer. Not gossip, not judgment, something closer to awe, the kind of hush people usually reserve for the names carved on stone walls. Walt hadn't spoken at a town meeting in years. He wasn't known for involving himself in disputes or debates. He lived alone in a modest two-room cabin just beyond the tree line, with a wood stove that hissed in the winter and a porch that groaned when the wind shifted. Most of the younger generation wouldn't recognize anything special in him. To them, he was the quiet old man they passed at the hardware store or saw feeding stray cats behind the VFW. They might nod politely and move along, never knowing who he really was. But the older residents remembered. They remembered the teenager who enlisted at 17, the young mechanic who completed 3 brutal tours in Vietnam. They remembered how he disappeared into the hills afterward, hollow-eyed and carrying a grief only those who survive war understand. They remembered his brother, who didn't come home, and the 2 local boys who did only because Walt had dragged them, half-conscious, through fire. So when he set foot on the courthouse steps that morning, people took notice. He didn't speak. He didn't acknowledge the whispers or the nods. He just kept walking forward with the quiet precision of a man following orders only he could hear. Several veterans seated on benches nearby stirred at the sight of him. One removed his cap, another offered a slow nod, not just in greeting but in recognition, as if saluting not just the man but everything he'd lived through. Inside, the courtroom was already half full. A blend of attorneys, clerks, and curious residents occupied the wooden pews. The air buzzed softly with the sounds of shuffling paper and low murmurs. But as Walt crossed the threshold, a hush rolled through the room. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was the kind of silence that falls when something sacred enters. A collective, unspoken awareness that this moment was different. He carried no briefcase, no legal documents, no lawyer trailing behind him. Just that familiar blazer, a steady pace, and something larger than any bench or robe or gavel could command. The case itself? On paper, it was nothing extraordinary. A dispute over a property easement. Arguments about who had access to a strip of land, when they could cross it, and why. A civil hearing so unremarkable it wouldn't have filled a single pew on a regular day. But today wasn't regular, and everyone in the room felt it. Judge Raymond Kalulton had presided over that courtroom for more than 20 years. He was known for precision, for rules, for keeping his emotions locked behind a mask of professional indifference. In his eyes, the law was absolute, black and white lines that should never blur. Sentiment, he believed, clouded judgment. Gray areas frustrated him. Compassion? That belonged in homes and churches, not courtrooms. But on that morning, in that space, something was about to unravel. Something no statute, no precedent, no gavel could hold back. He believed anything that disrupted courtroom procedure was, in his view, a threat to judicial efficiency. So when Judge Colton entered the courtroom precisely 3 minutes past the hour, everything about his demeanor was crisp and calculated. He didn't look toward the gallery, didn't pause to acknowledge the low murmur of voices, didn't even glance at the witness stand where Walt Harland sat. Still quiet, composed like the granite monuments people pass without knowing their full weight. Walt wasn't a man who fidgeted. He sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, waiting with the calm of someone who had learned long ago the value of stillness. But even in his silence, one thing stood out, the glint of light off metal near his heart. It wasn't meant to draw attention, and it didn't shimmer with pride or vanity. It just was. The light blue ribbon, the bronze star, the subtle but unmistakable gleam of the Medal of Honor. A decoration known by its quiet dignity, understood by those who recognized what it cost to earn. To most in the room, it was more than a medal. It was a sacred emblem of sacrifice, valor, and an unspoken promise between a man and his nation. But to Judge Colton, it was a variable, an element outside his control, one that threatened the pristine order of his courtroom. Before any testimony could begin, Judge Colton cleared his throat and leaned toward his microphone. His voice was firm, not angry, clinical in its precision. "Mr. Harland," he said, tone clipped, "remove that medal before speaking to this court." The words struck the room like a stone tossed into a still lake. The ripple was immediate. Walt didn't blink. He didn't shift. His hands remained folded, his posture unchanged. He looked at the judge, not with rebellion or resentment, but with a tired understanding. The kind that said he'd seen men like Colton before, in darker places, where orders came with higher stakes. The crowd reacted before Walt did. A hush swept through the gallery, followed by a soft murmur. Some people gawked. Others exchanged uncertain glances. A woman near the back, elderly with white curls pinned in place, shook her head slowly, lips drawn into a tight line. A young man leaned forward, his brow furrowed in disbelief. But Judge Colton didn't flinch. He pressed on. "This is a court of law," he said, voice edged with mild reproach. "Not a ceremony. That medal, while no doubt meaningful, is not appropriate attire for witness testimony. Remove it, or you will not be allowed to proceed." The court clerk froze, caught mid-motion, eyes darting between the judge and the witness. The attorneys, once poised and attentive, now stared at their legal pads as if the pages offered some kind of refuge. No one moved. No one said a word, except Walt. He moved slowly, deliberately. There was no shame in his gesture, no reluctance, just intention. His hand rose to his chest, fingers searching beneath the lapel. He found the clasp and unfastened the metal with a practiced care. It wasn't heavy in the physical sense, but the moment it came free, something in the room felt altered, like a silence had dropped that no one had prepared for. He didn't hand it off. He didn't tuck it into a pocket. Instead, he gently set it on the edge of the witness stand, right beside the microphone. It still caught the light, but now it seemed removed, displaced, like a folded flag set aside with reverence, but not with peace. Walt leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, somewhere between memory and obligation. The air felt wrong, not just because of what was said, but because of what had been stifled. It wasn't the quiet of order, it was the silence of discomfort, of something sacred being mishandled. It left behind a question that no one dared ask aloud. Who gets to tell a man to take off his honor? Judge Colton gave a short nod. You may proceed, he said, or maybe he meant the attorneys. But by then, the damage was already done. The room had shifted. Something invisible and solemn had been disturbed, and even those who didn't fully grasp why could feel it press in around them. Walt's hands hovered, his movements slow, measured. Like muscle memory guided not by routine, but by history. He wasn't rushing, wasn't performing, just obeying, the way he once had in places saturated with sweat, oil, and gunpowder. This wasn't submission to the judge, it was acceptance of the moment, a quiet yielding not out of defeat, but understanding. His thumb found the small clasp beneath the worn edge of his blazer. With reverent fingers, he detached the metal. It was small, smaller than most imagined, a bronze star suspended from a pale blue ribbon dotted with white stars. In his hand, it looked both fragile and impossibly heavy. No one in the courtroom made a sound. The judge shifted slightly in his seat. The judge leaned back in his chair and began rearranging papers, signaling, at least in his mind, that the matter was resolved, that the courtroom had returned to its usual orderly rhythm. But no one else followed his lead. Not a single person moved. The stillness in the room thickened, heavy and quiet. Walt remained frozen, the metal resting in his open hand for just a moment longer. His gaze dropped, not in shame but in reflection. He wasn't looking at the judge. He wasn't seeing the courtroom. His eyes, though open, had traveled far from this place. His breath changed too, deeper, slower, like he was stepping through something invisible and profound before he could return to the present. And then, with the kind of care that speaks more loudly than words, he set the metal down. Not into a pocket, not in the bailiff's hand, not tucked beside his coat. He placed it right there on the smooth wood of the witness stand, next to the microphone, next to the legal pads and pens and papers meant for facts and figures. It didn't belong there. And yet, there it remained. That's what unsettled the room most. Courtrooms aren't built for symbolism. They're built for statements, for sworn truth, for logic. But the metal didn't need to be explained. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, not as jewelry, not as decoration, but as something undeniable. A statement made not with volume, but with weight. Across the gallery, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. A young man who had been half asleep moments earlier sat upright without realizing it. A woman in her 50s pressed a crumpled tissue to her lips, her eyes locked on the stand. A man in the second row stared so hard at the metal, it was as though he wasn't sure he was allowed to see it. No one spoke. The silence spoke for them. Walt folded his hands in front of him again. His expression was composed, but not with ease. It was the kind of stillness earned through endurance, the kind a man develops after carrying burdens far longer than any person should have to. The prosecutor attempted to clear his throat, but the sound came out dreamy, hesitant. Even he felt it. The absurdity of trying to move on to property boundaries and water runoff disputes while in that metal, that story, that weight, sat inches from a microphone like it had already given its own testimony. Judge Colton didn't acknowledge it. He simply carried on, unfazed, pretending the moment hadn't happened, as if justice, untouched, remained sealed behind his gavel. But those who knew better, especially the ones who had served, the ones who had waited, the ones who had lost, recognized that something had changed. This wasn't just procedural anymore. The judge, in trying to scrub the room clean of emotion, had unknowingly stirred something far deeper than sentiment. He had awakened reverence. Not the loud kind, not the kind that demands standing ovations or tears. This was quieter, heavier, a collective recognition shared in silence. And still, no one dared to touch the metal. Not the attorneys, not the clerk, even the bailiff, who kept sneaking glances toward it, like one might glance at a folded flag being handed to a grieving mother, didn't move a muscle. It rested there, the highest military honor the United States can bestow, sitting on a wooden ledge beside a microphone. Not worn, not claimed, but undeniably present. It was evidence. It was a burden. It was sacred. And somehow it didn't belong in that room, but neither could it be removed. Walt didn't reach for it again. He remained seated, still, silent, as if everything that mattered had already been said without a word. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, at last, Walt Harland began to speak. His voice was low, quiet, not from frailty, but from a lifetime of knowing when to speak and how little needed to be said. It was roughened by age and experience, deliberate and deeply measured. Every word he chose was spare, almost bare, but between each syllable something deeper hummed, a kind of strength that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with what had already been endured. The attorney adjusted his tie and stepped forward, attempting to pull the room back into its rhythm. "Mr. Harland, for the record, please state your full name and current occupation." "Walter Joseph Harland," came the immediate reply. "Retired, former helicopter crew chief, 1st Air Cavalry Division, U.S. Army." There was a pause. The lawyer blinked and nodded, finding his voice again. "And you were present at the property line the morning of July 14th? "I was." "Can you describe what brought you there?" Walt didn't shift. He stared straight ahead, as if watching a real play behind his eyes. "Got a call from my neighbor, Ed Langley. Said the irrigation trench behind our properties was backing up again. Asked if I could meet him and take a look. Said he'd bring the valve key." "And what did you find when you arrived?" Walt's gaze remained steady, eyes focused somewhere just past the courtroom wall, the memory opening up like a worn path under tired boots. Walt took a breath, steady and quiet, as though grounding himself in a memory far older than the courtroom walls around him. "There were 2 men," he began, voice low but firm. "Not Ed. I didn't recognize either of them. They were wearing suits. One of them had a laser rangefinder, told me I was trespassing." The attorney lifted an eyebrow, but it was Walt who posed the next question before it could be asked. "And were you?" Walt didn't bristle. He didn't even blink. His face stayed still, but the words he spoke came weighted with something undeniable. "I've had a key to that gate since 1987. Ed gave it to me himself, told me his father would have wanted me to use the land any time I needed it." The lawyer tilted his head, curious. "Why is that?" There was a shift in Walt's posture, not defensiveness, but something like reverence. His eyes sharpened, voice steady. "Because his father and I served on the same fire base. I pulled his father from a wreck at Huey, took a piece of shrapnel doing it. Man didn't walk right again, but he lived." There was no follow-up question. None was needed. The attorney stood silent, absorbing the weight of what had just been said. It hadn't come from his notes, and it didn't need a citation. Every person in that courtroom heard exactly what mattered. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel was scribbling something, but his pen began to slow as if even ink couldn't keep up with the moment. The attorney cleared his throat and continued, voice softer now. "Did you see any signs posted that day indicating you were prohibited from entering the property?" "No, sir. Same rusted chain, same faded sign. It's been like that for over 20 years. "And have you ever had reason to believe the easement had changed in any way?" Walt shook his head once. "No, thank you." The attorney took a step back. What followed wasn't the usual shuffling pause of moving from one speaker to another. It was something heavier, a silence that felt earned, like the air had to hold its breath out of respect. The judge shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his robe as if trying to reassert authority over a room that no longer belonged to him. His eyes flicked toward the prosecutor's table. "Cross-examination?" The younger man stood, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, trying to restore some courtroom rhythm. "Mr. Harlan, he began with studied casualness, would you agree that memories fade with time? Walt blinked slowly, once. I remember the names of the men who died under me, he said. I don't forget those. The smirk vanished. The prosecutor swallowed. No further questions, he mumbled, retreating to his seat. Walt turned back to the front of the courtroom. His expression revealed nothing, because this wasn't about him. Not really. He wasn't defending his own rights so much as standing for something far bigger. Something that wouldn't be entered into the transcript, but lived in the silence between his words. Beside him on the witness stand sat a small, worn box containing a silver star. Walt hadn't looked at it once. He didn't need to. Its presence was louder than any statement could be. Judge Colton leaned back in his chair, tapping the end of his pen against the polished wood of the bench. His jaw tensed as his gaze darted once, just once, toward the metal sitting beside the microphone. This court, he said slowly, firmly, deals in facts, not sentiment. His voice rang a little too loud in the hushed room, like a gavel dropped before its time. A few heads turned, not toward the judge, but toward the medal, toward the man who had earned it. Colton noticed, and it only hardened his tone. I don't care how many medals someone's collected, he continued, deliberately skirting the words Medal of Honor or Valor. Respect in this courtroom is earned through procedure, not nostalgia. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery, quick, uneasy. Colton's glare silenced it, but the damage had been done. Something had shifted. A new kind of discomfort settled over the room. Room, thick and inescapable. Near the back, an older man wearing a Vietnam vet cap clenched the arms of his seat, his knuckles pale. The young woman beside him reached over and gently rested her hand over his wrist. Across the aisle, someone slowly removed their cap. Not from legal obligation, but reverence. Still, Colton pressed on, seemingly unaware or unwilling to feel the change in the room's air. We're not here to relive war stories, he declared. We're here to settle a property dispute. Let's not turn this courtroom into a museum. He might as well have spit on the floor. That line, flippant, dismissive, hollow, was when the shift became something irreversible. There was no outrage, no protest, just a stillness. A shared quiet that said, you've gone too far. Even the lawyers looked uneasy now. The prosecutor stared down at his notes, as if trying to sink beneath them. The defense attorney, who had stood so confidently earlier, suddenly looked younger, less sure of himself. And Walt? Walt sat unmoving, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes fixed forward. If the judge's words had cut him, he didn't show it, but others did. The courtroom had once been a place Judge Colton thought he could control with sharp legal jargon and a firm tone. But now, as he looked around, something had shifted. He couldn't name it, but he felt it. An authority lost, not wrested from him violently but gently, irreversibly. Clearing his throat as if to reset the energy, he muttered, let's continue, as though sheer willpower could restore the old order. But the air had changed. The rules were no longer about property lines, irrigation disputes, or dry legal easements. This was now about something far deeper, about dignity, the kind that didn't demand to be heard but simply was. The metal that had been set down, silent and unassuming, had said more than any speech. It had redefined the room. Though Judge Colton still held the gavel, the room no longer belonged to him. Walt turned just slightly in his seat, his eyes drifting to the silver star resting nearby. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. He didn't need to. His gaze alone acknowledged what had been devalued, diminished, nearly dismissed, and reclaimed it, not with possession, but with presence. The judge had just spoken, trying to usher the court forward, trying to move on. That's when it happened. A faint creak echoed from a wooden chair near the rear of the gallery. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the silence like a razor. A man stood. No one had really noticed him before. He'd entered quietly, unobtrusively, choosing a seat in the back without drawing a single glance. Nothing about him demanded attention, until now. He was wearing the deep, formal green of a U.S. Army dress uniform. The posture was military strays, boots so polished they caught the light. Rows of ribbons marched across his chest in immaculate alignment, and at the center, unmistakable, hung the Medal of Honor. The heads of every person in the courtroom turned in unison, like a field of sunflowers following the sun. Even those who had tuned out earlier were suddenly alert, leaning forward, wide-eyed. The man didn't walk forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your Honor," he said, calm, composed. His voice wasn't loud, yet it carried with a weight that filled every corner. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of presence. Quiet, unshakable authority wrapped in humility. Judge Colton blinked. For the first time that morning, he looked unsettled, off balance. "This is a court of law," Colton said, his voice thinner now, reaching for rules. "Unless you've been subpoenaed or are acting as legal counsel." "I am neither," the man said, still unmoving. "But I served 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. And I've earned the right to speak when a decorated veteran is publicly humiliated in a courtroom of his own country." The words struck with a force more powerful than any gavel. Colton opened his mouth, then stopped. He had nothing. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Then slowly someone in the third row rose to their feet. An older man with a Marine Corps pin on his lapel. He said nothing, just stood. Moments later, another followed. A woman, her bracelet suggesting Army service. Then another, removing his cap and holding it solemnly to his chest. No chance, no noise, no spectacle. Just presence, just witnessing. One by one, across the gallery, veterans stood, quiet, still, unwavering. The man in uniform hadn't moved. He remained in the back, eyes locked on the judge. Then once more, his voice cut through the hush. "May I speak, Your Honor?" Colton didn't answer. He couldn't. The answer had already echoed from the walls, carried in the silence of those who stood behind the man. For the first time all day, Judge Colton did not speak. Not because he didn't want to, but because he no longer knew how to reclaim the space he had once commanded. The man with the Medal of Honor stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward. The medal at his chest gleamed faintly in the courtroom light, not as a badge of pride, but as a quiet dare. Do better. He didn't shout. He didn't march toward the bench. He simply held the room. Then with quiet intent, he took a step forward. Then another. The sharp echo of his boots against the tile floor rang out like a drum beat, the only sound in a room full of reverence. Walt remained still, hands folded, eyes down, not from shame but from understanding. Recognition, a shared language that didn't need words. As the officer approached the front of the courtroom, more veterans stood. 3 more, then 5, then nearly a dozen. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood, with caps pressed to chests, heads bowed, expressions caught in that fine space between respect and quiet fury, and the silence they carried. That spoke volume. The officer approaches the witness stand, but he didn't speak right away. His eyes lowered, settling on the silver star placed beside the microphone. He stared at it, silent, as if standing before a gravestone rather than a courtroom object. For a long breath, he didn't move, as though the weight of that medal held him still. Then, with deliberate care, he reached out with both hands, not to touch a piece of metal, but to lift a memory, something sacred. He held it not like evidence, but like a relic of a brotherhood most would never understand. He held it longer than anyone expected, and then turned toward the bench. "This," he said, his voice quiet, reverent, as he raised the medal just slightly, "is not jewelry. It's not with show. It's not for drawing eyes. This is a gravestone, small enough to carry in your hand." The judge tensed, his posture stiffening at the words. But the officer didn't raise his voice. He took a single step forward and continued, calm and certain. "I knew Walt Harland," he said. "Not from articles, not from ceremonies or memorials. I knew him from Cambodia. I watched him pull my commander out of a chopper that was burning from the inside out, with one arm broken and fire licking at his legs. And then he went back in for the rest of the crew." His words were not for drama, they were for truth, and the room felt it. No one moved. Even the court stenographer had frozen, her fingers hovering above the keys. "He never told that story, never wanted to, but I was there." The silence grew heavy, like the weight of something too long unspoken. "You asked him to take off this medal," the officer said, each word deliberate. "But you didn't just ask him to remove metal. You asked him to separate himself from everything he's lived through, from the men he buried, from the blood that soaked into his skin so it wouldn't have to touch yours. He turned slightly now, his gaze shifting from the bench to the gallery, where row after row of veterans had risen in quiet solidarity. You speak of courtroom decorum, he continued, but what you really mean is comfort. You are uncomfortable, sitting across from something you never earned. And so, you try to diminish it. Judge Colton opened his mouth, perhaps to object and to defend himself, but no words came out. The officer turned back toward Walt. You didn't remove it, he said gently. You surrendered it, and that's what hurts the most. Walt slowly rose from his seat. Their eyes met. No smiles, no nostrils, just a long, silent exchange of something deeper than language. And then they embraced. Not for show, not for sympathy. It was the kind of embrace shared between soldiers when words no longer suffice, when grief, honor, and memory are all tangled in one gesture. When they parted, Walt took the medal back. He didn't pin it on, he simply held it in his hand. The officer turned once more to face the judge. You've embarrassed a war hero, he said, quiet but firm, in front of his fellow veterans, his neighbors, and your own staff. The consequences of that choice are not mine to hand down. And with that, he turned away, walking down the center aisle of the courtroom. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. As he passed each row, the veterans stood taller. Some saluted in silence, some only nodded. But one by one, they all rose. Not a single clap, not a single word, just the soundless judgment of presence, of witness. And slowly, like a wave of reverence sweeping through the room, the entire courtroom stood. The moment didn't end in that room. By the end of the week, a short, grainy cell phone video, just 47 seconds long, had made its way online. Shot from the back row, it captured only the voice of the officer quietly saying, "May I speak?" in the silent rising of veterans as he walked. No filters, no edits, just truth. That clip spread faster than any court transcript could ever hope to. First through veteran forums, then through family chats, and finally into national newsrooms. Headlines followed. Judge demands war hero. Remove medal. Silence ends his career. The day honor spoke louder than the gavel. He surrendered the medal, but the nation stood up. By Monday morning, the story had reached every major outlet. Newscasters used words like disgrace, humiliation, and misconduct. But it wasn't the media that ignited the change. It was the veterans. Over 200 active duty and retired officers signed an open statement condemning Judge Colton's actions. Military support organizations released formal complaints to the state's Judicial Conduct Board. A retired Navy admiral appeared on national television, calling Colton's conduct an institutional insult to every man and woman who has ever earned a combat medal. And the letters began to pour in, not from lawyers, not from political groups, from regular people. Nurses, janitors, teachers, truck drivers, from veterans' families, from citizens who had never written to any government agency in their lives. Thousands of handwritten letters flooded the courthouse, each one demanding accountability, each one saying in their own way, this mattered, this hurt, this won't be forgotten. Colton's re-election campaign quietly unraveled. Local bar associations, though cautious, issued subtle rebukes. Even a sitting senator, herself the daughter of a Korean War veteran, tweeted, "A courtroom that silences honor cannot claim to serve justice." But Judge Raymond Colton? He said nothing. No interviews, no public appearances, no apologies. By Thursday morning, a brief, impersonal notice appeared on the courthouse bulletin board. Effective immediately, Judge Raymond Colton will be stepping down for personal reasons. All scheduled cases have been reassigned. No mention of the medal. No mention of Walt Harland. No acknowledgement of the exact moment everything came crashing down. But by Friday, everyone understood. The brass nameplate on his courtroom door had vanished. He had entered that week cloaked in full authority. By the end, his legacy had been reduced to a single command, not written in a ruling, but spoken aloud, clear and cold. Remove that medal before speaking to this court. Yet it wasn't the sentence itself that endured in people's minds. It was what followed, the silence, the stand, and the voice, unshaken and calm, that made a nation stop and listen. The courtroom never acknowledged the moment officially, No plaque, no tribute, just an absence that echoed louder than words. But far beyond those four walls, something began to shift. And somewhere in a quiet stretch of countryside, Walt Harland came home, the medal still in hand, and no need to say another word. Walt didn't seek out cameras. He didn't return phone calls from talk show hosts or respond to heartfelt letters from strangers. When a local reporter came knocking a week after the incident, Walt listened quietly, then simply said, "There's nothing that needs explaining," before returning to his chopping block to split firewood. He had never wanted any of this. Not the media attention, not the headlines, certainly not the applause. He hadn't stood in that courtroom to make a political statement or chase glory. He had done it because someone needed him, because a neighbor asked, because he gave his word. That was who Walt Harland was, and still is. He returned to his weathered cabin just outside town, to the porch with the creaky step and the chipped coffee mug his late wife once loved. To the rhythm of his life, early morning walks, quiet nods exchanged at the gas station, feeding the 3 stray cats that waited faithfully by his shed each evening. Nothing had changed in Walt. Same old coat, same pew at church every Sunday, same rusted truck parked beneath the sycamore tree on Main Street. But the town had changed. People who used to pass by without a glance now paused, not to crowd him, not to praise him, but to offer a simple nod, a handshake, a soft thank you that carried the weight of something much deeper than ceremony. It was the kind of recognition that doesn't need an audience, only understanding. Young men who just a weekend earlier hadn't known what a Medal of Honor even looked like, now whispered about it in barbershops. High schoolers asked their teachers if they could write essays about the old man in the courtroom. A local pastor rewrote his Sunday sermon, not to speak of war, but of dignity. And Walt, he let it all pass through him like wind through tall grass. He never wore the medal again. But he didn't hide it either. It sat quietly now on a small wooden stand in his living room, just below a neatly folded flag, and beside a black and white photo of 3 young men in uniform, one of whom would forever be 20 years old. Walt never told the full story. He didn't need to. Because in one moment, in a courtroom built for judgment, he reminded a town and a country what honor sounds like when it doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't even speak. Walt never wanted to be remembered, but he was, not for standing tall, but for refusing to be made small. He didn't rise, he simply didn't bow. Some stories don't need a grand finale, they just need to be remembered. And Walt Harland, in his quiet defiance, gave voice to thousands, those who carried the burden of service without ever asking for anything in return. Long after the noise of battle faded and the dust of conflict settled, what remained wasn't about medals, courtroom decisions, or headlines. It was something far deeper, something quieter. What happened that day wasn't just about justice being served or dignity being restored in front of a judge. It was about how we, as a people, choose to see one another. Not through ceremony or spectacle, but through a simple act of respect, genuine, unwavering, and deeply human. It was about a man named Walt, whose silence spoke louder than any speech, whose stillness carried more weight than any outburst. In a world that often confuses volume for truth, where shouting seems to win over listening and performance outshines presence, Walt's quiet dignity cut through the noise like a steady flame in a windstorm. It reminded us of something we once held sacred, perhaps something we've lost sight of. That true honor does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It simply is, unshakable, grounded, enduring. Strength, real strength, doesn't push or posture. It doesn't need applause or recognition. Sometimes it simply stands its ground when no one's watching, holds the line when the cameras are gone, and chooses what is right even when it costs everything. And in that courtroom, when Walt didn't raise his voice, when he didn't demand acknowledgement, his very presence revealed something raw and essential. How rare it has become to recognize quiet courage. So maybe the real question we're left with isn't about Walt alone, but about all of us. Have we forgotten how to honor humility? In our obsession with likes, shares, and viral moments, have we stopped noticing the quiet ones? The neighbor who shows up without being asked, the parent who sacrifices without complaint, The veteran who carries the weight of service without ever asking for thanks. These people don't crave the spotlight, but they deserve something more lasting than applause. They deserve our respect, our presence, our silence. The kind of listening that doesn't interrupt, that doesn't rush to react, but just receives. Because they've earned that, through endurance, through grace, through quiet acts of courage most will never see. So if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone you love, someone you admire, someone you lost, tell us. Share your story in the comments. Whether it's a family member, a friend, a mentor, or a fellow veteran, we want to hear about the quiet heroes in your life, the ones who never asked for credit but deserved it all the same. And if you believe stories like Walt's still matter, if you believe that truth doesn't need to shout to be powerful, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We're building a space where stories of real strength, silent endurance, and unshakable integrity have a home. Because sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is keep going, with no audience, no fanfare, and no demand for recognition. Just purpose, just heart, just the quiet, steady beat of honor lived out, one breath at a time. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.